Well, welcome to another edition of Christian Answers. My name is Pastor Jeff Short, and today we are in a new year, and I wanted to just summarize and recap some of the discussion about the observance of Christmas every year, and that discussion comes up every Christmas season. And as Christians, it should, because we want to evaluate and we want to think about and ponder what we actually are doing in our worship, in our celebration of Christmas, in our obedience to Christ, in our following the Bible, in our church practices, and so forth. We want to think about these things. We don't want to just drift along as a society teaches us to drift. We want to actually follow the Lord's will. And so when we think about Christmas, every year we began to reflect on where it has become, it has become in our society, in our secular society. We go back to what it was in the early days, go back to the Bible, and we try to put things together. We try to piece things together and ask ourselves, are we celebrating Christmas the way God would have us celebrate Christmas? I don't want to say that there's only one way to celebrate Christmas, but I want to think about these issues, and I want to take the program today to think about these issues. Now, every once in a while, I do hear people bring up the objections that the Pilgrims, the Puritans, that's what the Pilgrims were. They were a form of Puritanism, and they were Protestants. And once in a while I hear Catholic objections to Protestantism saying that the Protestants, the early Protestants, were against the observance of Christmas, and they point to the Pilgrims, the early founders of this nation. When they came over from Europe, they did not observe Christmas. In fact, they made a point of not observing Christmas because they didn't want to be like the European church. They didn't want to do what the European churches were doing in observance to Christmas. And they also point out the fact that it took many, many decades in the New World, in the United States, as we now call it, this land, North America, many decades before that Puritanism, that rejection of the celebration of Christmas was done away with, and began to celebrate. All people, even Protestants of all types, began to celebrate Christmas here in the United States, this territory. And so they say, see, those Protestants, they were killjoys, they were party poopers, they are sad sacks, they were prudish, they didn't want to experience the joy of the Lord, and so forth. And then others say, and then others will make the charge that some Christians even today are like Scrooge, who was against Christmas. If you remember the Christmas Carol, Charles Dickens' great novel, and it's now into movie form in many different versions. Scrooge, the main character in that movie, was against Christmas. In fact, the phrase bah humbug comes from that novel. And there are people today that don't like Christmas, and they look to Scrooge, and people charge Christians who don't go into all of the things about Christmas and all of the celebrations about Christmas as Scrooges. And I want to talk about why that is not a good analogy, and that is a false charge, because Scrooge actually opposed Christmas on an entirely different basis. His was just he didn't want his business to be closed on the 25th of December. He didn't feel that he wanted to stop business, didn't want to not make a profit on that day. He wanted to make money all year long, and he didn't like it when some people would ask for the day off on Christmas Day. He felt that he was being robbed, and he felt that Christmas was an interruption in the economic activity of his business, and so he opposed it on that basis, not on any spiritual basis, not on for theological reasons. It was just simply a monetary basis. He didn't like the interruption in his cash flow, and so he opposed Christmas. It could have been any holiday he would have been against, because anything that kept back money from his bank and anything that hurt his business he would oppose. Well, that's totally different than what the Pilgrims did when they opposed the celebration of Christmas. And I want to talk about what the Pilgrims did, and I want to also talk about how some of their ideas can be applied today. We would want to apply some of their ideas today, and then how some of their ideas we would not want to apply today as Christians, and how they actually, the Puritans, got some things right and they got some things wrong, and we can't just simply label them as bad and negative and Grinch who stole Christmas kind of people. We need to understand what they thought and what they felt, and then after we understand them, then we can begin to honestly evaluate whether they were right, wholly wrong, or partly right or partly wrong. Then we can only evaluate them. So let me raise the question, what was it that the Puritans had a problem with Christmas about? What was it that they had their differences with those who celebrated Christmas? Because there were people, most people on the continent of Europe, most Christians in Europe did celebrate Christmas, because after all, Christmas, if you break down the word Christmas, it's Christ Mass. Christ Mass. And Christ, Jesus Christ, the Lord, and Mass, the church celebration service. And so on Christmas Day, December 25th, there would be a Christ Mass. And that was where Christmas came from. And the 12 days of Christmas actually start on Christmas Day and they go into the new year. We don't think of the 12 days of Christmas so much anymore. We think of the whole holiday season. We think of even after Thanksgiving. Sometimes now before Thanksgiving we begin to think of the Christmas season. But it wasn't always like that. And the Pilgrims were reacting against what was taking place on the continent of Europe at that time among Catholic churches and Protestant churches. We shouldn't think of Christmas as simply a Catholic celebration, even though it was originally from the old Catholic Church, and it formed into what it was at the time of the Pilgrims, the time of the Puritans. But the Protestant churches also observed Christmas on the continent, some of them more, some of them less, but there was some kind of Christmas observance even among Protestant churches. Now, the Pilgrims, who were Puritans, they had a problem with the way the Protestant churches were functioning at that time in Europe, because they felt that the Protestant churches were not reformed enough. They felt that the Protestant churches had been compromised, and they looked, for example, at many of the practices in the Protestant churches and said there is no biblical basis for this practice or that practice. And you have to understand that there is no one Protestant form of Christianity. There were a number of different forms of Christianity. In fact, there were some main divisions of the Protestants. There were the Lutherans, and that entailed a whole branch of Protestantism. And then there was the Reformed branch of Protestantism, mostly Presbyterians and others. And then there was the Anabaptist version of Protestantism, and that was different also. So there were all kinds of different expressions of Protestantism, and the Puritans and the Pilgrims were part of the Puritan movement. They wanted to flee Europe because they felt that Christianity was corrupt. They didn't want to be forced into observing and celebrating and participating in churches that they felt had not gone far enough in the Reformation and had still vestiges of corruption. And so they fled to the North American continent, to make those corrections. So that's the context in which they had their theology about Christmas. But let's talk more about their theology of Christmas in our second part of Christian Answers Don't Go Away. Well, welcome to part 2 of Christian Answers. We're talking about the Puritans, the Pilgrims that came over to this country, helped found this nation. We're talking about why they might have objected to the celebration of Christmas. As far as we can tell, in the records, the Pilgrims who came over here to establish the settlement in New England did not celebrate Christmas, or did not celebrate in any way that we know of a celebration. Now, that doesn't mean that they opposed remembering and reading and reflecting on and taking joy in the birth of Jesus Christ. No, they did take the Bible very seriously. They would teach and they did preach about the birth of Jesus Christ. They did discuss it, they did talk about it, and they did take joy in the birth of Jesus Christ. What we're saying is they just simply didn't have a season of celebration. They didn't have a special time of celebrating the birth of Jesus Christ any more than any other of the important events in Christ's life. They did emphasize more of the resurrection of Christ and his death on the cross for our sins. They talk probably more about that because the Bible talks more about that. And they reflected on that, and they preached that, and that was the good news that Jesus Christ came to die on the cross for our sins, and that by faith in him and faith alone we might be saved from the wrath of God for judgment of sin. And they talked a lot about that, and they emphasized the crucifixion, death, burial, and resurrection of Christ and the new life in the Spirit more than they emphasized the birth of Jesus Christ. But that doesn't mean that they didn't appreciate the birth of Jesus Christ. That didn't mean that they didn't preach about it and teach about it. They just simply didn't have a special celebration for it. And if you want to get strictly biblical, and if you want to go back to the very early church, the early church didn't have a special season or special celebration for the birth of Jesus Christ either. As far as we can tell, the early church, we don't see anything like a celebration of the birth of Jesus in the biblical description of the early church. We have a few instances in the book of Acts where we actually get a glimpse of the New Testament biblical church, and we don't see any indication that they had any special holiday around the birth of Jesus Christ. We know that they celebrated the Lord's Supper frequently, and that was a celebration of his death, burial, and resurrection. But as far as the birth of Jesus Christ, we don't have any indication that the early church in the Bible had any kind of special celebration for it every year, or any season for it. And then when we go outside of the Bible into the early century, the first century of the Christian church, we don't see a special season of celebration for the birth of Jesus Christ, or anything called Christmas, or anything like what we know of Christmas today. And so when you look at the Pilgrims, and you look at the early founders of this country who came over and fled Europe because they wanted to escape the corrupt European continent, specifically the religious climate, the religious situation over there. They wanted to start a new church and a new expression of Christianity, and which was, they felt, pure and more biblical. They wanted to start from scratch, and they wanted to live out their faith without the baggage of the past and all the customs and traditions and everything that was being done in Europe. They did not participate in Christmas because they saw it as an example of the wider corruption. Now, if you look at the biblical, like I said, the early biblical church and the early church, the Pilgrims were actually more closely aligned with the biblical church and the early church than we are, because there was not a season of celebration for the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, that doesn't mean there shouldn't be today. I'm just simply saying the Pilgrims are following the biblical example And they are following it very literally, in fact, because there's no mention of Christmas in the Bible, and there's no mention of Christmas in the early church, early century of the church. And so the Pilgrims are well within their rights to not celebrate it, because the Bible doesn't actually tell us to celebrate it, and the early church history doesn't indicate that it was celebrated. And so before we say that the Pilgrims were Scrooges and Killjoys and sad sacks and call them names or anything, we need to be careful, because we're actually calling the early church and the early century Christians the same thing, because they didn't do Christmas either. And so we need to be careful in our criticisms and understand the context. Now, the Puritans who came over here, called the Pilgrims, they felt that the European church was corrupt, and that Christmas and its celebration was also an expression of that corruption. Is that true? Is it true that the European church was corrupt, and that its expression of Christmas in its many different forms, the Catholic form, the Protestant form, the Lutheran form, the Reformed form, were these church expressions of Christmas corrupt as well? And that's a judgment that cannot just simply have one answer, because some churches were more pure and aligned with the Bible and did try to observe a somewhat of a remembrance of the birth of Christ in a more restrained and appropriate way. And then other churches in other areas of Europe were less restrained. And the worst case situations, of course, were these churches that were more community churches, that were more social churches, and they actually had these festivals, these feast days, where the participants were overindulging, and they were drunken, carousing, and it was basically a big party. It was a social, they were out there overindulging, over drinking. They were acting inappropriate, acting unseemly, the loosening of morality. And instead of a more pure and holy time of remembrance of Christ, they were actually overindulging in all of the vices, and it was a mess in different parts of Europe and in different situations, in different church contexts. And so the Puritans had grounds for rejecting that kind of a celebration of Christmas. And just as we do today, I mean, it's a scandal to be celebrating Christmas and participating in some of the activities and being a part of some of these scenes that are around today. And it has nothing to do with God. It has nothing to do with the Bible. It has nothing to do with Christ. There really is no room for the remembrance and reflection of Jesus and his nativity when you're partying and getting drunk and you're getting high and you're going from bar to bar, or you're carousing and doing all sorts of vices that have nothing to do with God. That is a mockery of the original intent of Christmas, but that was taking place in Europe. So the Pilgrims had grounds for what they were protesting, and we need to consider those grounds, and we need to not judge them so harshly, and we need to understand that they were doing what they felt was a good thing, which was restraining themselves and refraining from these excessive celebrations and feast day festivals. And so we need to understand that when we look back in history. And then on the next segment, in part 3, we're going to be talking about what should be our response today in light of our Christian history, in light of some of the criticisms of the excessive celebration of Christmas, and what is an appropriate expression of Christmas and celebration of this holiday every year. So we'll talk more about that in part 3. Don't go away. Well, welcome again to part 3. This is the Christian Answers program with Pastor Jeff Short. That's myself. And we're talking about Christmas. What is the proper celebration of Christmas? The Puritans, the pilgrims that came over here, they felt that it was appropriate to not have a special time of the year to celebrate the birth of Christ, mainly in reaction to what was taking place in Europe, the corruption that they saw in the church at that time, and the corruption and the degradation of spiritual themes during, of all things, the Christmas season. And so they wanted to make sure that they didn't participate in any of that, so they went to the opposite end and said, we're not going to participate in Christmas. And that attitude lasted here in the United States for a number of decades after the original founding there in New England by the Pilgrims. But then it eventually began to fade away into more of a moderate participation of Christmas by everyone, even those that followed in the wake of the Pilgrims tradition and Protestantism. And eventually in our country, in the United States, both Protestants and Catholics, and most people, all people, whether they were a part of a church or not, they did celebrate Christmas. And now we get to the modern era, and we have definitely a celebration of Christmas, but we have to ask ourselves, is the celebration that we celebrate now, is it really about Christmas, or is it just about having a big party and having an excuse to party and celebrate, and have we lost the main theme, which is Jesus and his birth? And we have to agree that we definitely have lost a lot of the original intent of the church's celebration of Christmas. Even though the church, the historical Christian church through the ages, even in its bringing out the birth of Jesus as a special time of the year to celebrate, even though the church itself is partly to blame for the excesses because it allowed and permitted these feast days and festivals to become what they did become in Europe. And then the Puritan reaction against that excess was felt here in the United States with the Pilgrims. And then eventually, though, that kind of Puritan attitude was dropped and the United States began to embrace Christmas, and then we began to fall into many of the same kinds of excesses that the Europeans had fallen into and that the Pilgrims reacted against. So here we are today, and what we have is a real excess of celebration of the holiday of Christmas. And we can only imagine what the Pilgrims would have felt if they had seen how we celebrate Christmas today. But so how do we celebrate Christmas today? Well, in our culture, there is a heavy emphasis on the materialism of Christmas, of the buying and selling of goods around Christmas time. And that is partly to be blamed on the stores and the corporations in the modern era because of advertisements and the way how our economy shapes so much of our society today. We don't realize how much the economy drives a lot of what takes place in society. We don't think about that because we're all busy living our lives, but if you stop back and you think about it, the economy makes a lot of decisions for us socially, and one of those decisions that economics has made for us in the last 100 years or so in this country is that Christmas has become very, very materialistic, and we have to all agree on that. There is a lot of excess materialism at Christmas time, and that's one of the main criticisms. We've all heard that, and we all probably agree that Christmas often gets left behind. The true meaning of Christmas, Jesus, often gets left behind for the presents and the giving and all of the buying and all of the other activities. Another thing that has added to the excesses of the Christmas celebration today is all of the additional and excessive new modern traditions of what Christmas means. You now have the Santa Claus tradition. You now have the Frosty the Snowman, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. All of these now modern traditions, the Grinch that Stole Christmas, and this has all been helped by the television media and a lot of Hollywood and movies. Now you have, in addition to the original biblical Christmas story of Jesus, you have all of these other stories that have been added to the Christmas season. And so now everyone has not only the biblical tradition and the accounts of the historical Jesus being born, you have now all of these other secular traditions, even like the Christmas Carol by Dickens. That is a secular Christmas tradition. And then you have It's a Wonderful Life movie, and you have all of the other things that are added as far as Christmas music. At one time, it was mostly all church music, church hymns that were celebrated during the Christmas season. Now, in more and more and more, you have secular songs about the season, about the snow, let it snow, let it snow, let it snow. You have songs about Santa Claus. You have songs about, now the big trend among pop singers is you don't even actually have to have any theme of Christmas. You just have to use the word Christmas. And if you use the word Christmas in your song, then it is a Christmas song. So you can sing and talk about anything you want, but you just have to throw in the word Christmas, then it's a Christmas song. And all of these now get incorporated into the Christmas tradition to the point where now you can throw everything in there and it now counts as a Christmas tradition. And some of these traditions are only 2 or 3 years old. Others are 25 years old. Some are 50 years old. But it seems like now we just keep adding and piling on different Christmas traditions, and to the point where it's very easy, in fact, it's very common to lose the whole original intent of Christmas. And in that sense, it is being corrupted. And so we need to listen to the Pilgrims. We need to see and understand what they were objecting to when they said that they would not be celebrating Christmas. We need to hear what they say, and we also need to then weigh what they reacted against and say, was that excessive reaction or was that appropriate? And I would say, as a Christian today, that it is possible to celebrate Christmas, the real and true meaning of Christmas, the biblical message of Christmas, without getting caught up or distracted by these other things that are coming in now to the celebration, if we keep in mind that we don't have to celebrate everything that is called Christmas. We don't have to participate in everything that the media and that our culture is calling Christmas. We can prune it down to the essentials. We can simplify Christmas, and we can restrain ourselves from being materialistic like our culture is pushing, and we can rein in all these other extra things, these other distractions, and focus in on the spiritual. And if we do that, we can properly emphasize the birth of Jesus. It is a good tradition. I feel in my own heart that it's a good emphasis to emphasize the birth of Jesus. Even though it's not a biblical celebration, we can actually add it to our own calendars as Christians because it's a good and healthy thing. But we need to remember to not go too far in including too many other things in that celebration so that we water down the main thing. Well, I hope that's been helpful to you and you're thinking about Christmas, but we'll see you back here next week on Christian Answers. God bless.